All right. So before we get into the simulation argument, I think it's good to talk about inductive arguments. There's a lot to be said on inductive arguments. You could teach an entire course just on this. I'd kind of like to, but we don't have such a course. You guys didn't sign up for it. So I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details, but I think it's worth saying a little bit about inductive arguments and how Bostrom's particular inductive argument is supposed to work. So the simplest take on Bostrom is, I think, that his argument is something like the following, or takes something like the following form. Suppose you've got a bag of marbles, right? And, person tells you there's 99 red marbles in here, one blue marble. I'm going to shake it up. I want you to close your eyes, stick your hand in. Identical marbles, all it's different is the color. You pick one out. What do you think the chances that you will pick a red marble are? This is not a trick question. You guys are thinking, there's some trick here. No, right? The chances that you will pick a red marble are 99 in 100. The chances you will pick a blue marble, 1 in 100, right? Given that the vast majority of marbles are red, the chances are you will pick a red marble. All right. Well, Bostrom will say, well, look, if my argument's right, the vast majority of worlds are simulations. Most, in fact, all but one is a simulation. There's a lot of these simulations. No reason to think our particular world is special. It's basically like picking a world from the bag. No, it's an odd image, right? If you can even think of an image. So if most worlds are simulations and you pick one out of the bag at random, it's probably going to be a simulation. Most are simulations. Ours is like one picked out of the bag at random, probably a simulation. Now, I think, I gave you guys a simplified version of Bostrom's argument because the actual article, the longer article he publishes this in, there's not a lot of super hard math. I mean, there's a little bit. There's a lot of symbolism that, I don't know, he thinks is necessary, makes everything look nice and neat and impresses us philosophers. I kind of think it's useless, but, whatever. But there is a lot more detail in his longer article. Some of it is I just think, oh, wow, look at these symbols. Aren't they great? Aren't they cool? Right? People in the Middle Ages had Latin. People in the modern world, when they want to seem smart, they have symbols, mathy stuff, right? I think there's a lot of that going on in Bostrom's article. We lose that in the short version. I'm not super sad about it. But there is a bit more detail. And I think it's good to kind of zero in on this. I think it's a little more complicated than just most worlds are simulations. Pick one at random. It's probably a simulation. Have fun with that, right? So I do think it's important to see this slightly more complicated feature of inductive arguments that I think is going on in his argument to face an objection we're going to run into in a couple lectures. Because I think he has a pretty good response. I also think that the stuff I'm about to go over is just interesting and important in itself. And look, one of my points talking about Bostrom is people make stupid mistakes with inductive arguments. I mean, Bostrom doesn't. He's a smart guy. But a lot of people do, and I think this stuff we're going to talk about will, help you to avoid some of them at least. Okay, so let's take a step way back from the Bostrom stuff and just for a second talk about something that seems different. So, base rates. Base rates are really important. And I think they're going to be important for Bostrom's argument, or at least when thinking about a certain objection to it I'll talk about in a minute. And I think the best way to think about this concept of base rates and to see why they're important is to, look at a little example, right? So we'll go with one with a disease, right? I have a lot of friends and a lot of family members who are a little prone to hypochondria. Probably a little prone myself, right? My mom was a nurse for years. She had medical books at home. If you're a slightly anxious child, reading medical books is probably not a great way to spend your days. You become convinced you have all sorts of novel and bizarre diseases, right? Anyway, so let's take this guy Pat, right? Just random guy. He becomes convinced he has a deadly disease. We'll call it idiopathic syndrome. If you guys are as geeky as me, you'll know that idiopathic syndrome is a disease that Captain Picard has in an episode of Star Trek where they go into the future. If you don't know that, whatever. But if you do, I don't know. I'm making the little live long and prosper symbol as I sit here, right? It's off camera, because there is no camera. Anyway, fake disease from Star Trek, we'll just use it as a sort of a name, sort of a placeholder, right? But let's say it's a deadly disease and this guy, it really was a disease and this guy thinks he had it. So idiopathic syndrome, rare generally, but especially for people like this guy, right? Age, gender, other factors will determine how likely you are to have a disease. Let's say that people like him only have a 1 in 100,000 chance of having the disease. 0.001%. I hope that's right. I'm not great at math myself, right? But anyway. Suppose that this guy Pat somehow gets tested and the test is 99% accurate. Now, for reasons I'll talk about, I don't think in this situation any doctor worth his medical license would actually give him a test, but imagine he somehow got tested. Test is 99% accurate, by which I mean 99% of the time when it says you have the disease, you have the disease. In 99 cases where it says you have it, you have it. In one case out of 100, it gives, a false positive. The person doesn't really have the disease. So our test says that this guy has it. He has idiopathic syndrome. How worried should he be? How likely is it that he has idiopathic syndrome? "99%, 90%, 50-50, less than 1%, we can't possibly know, or none of the above." Now, I'm going to guess that your first guess here, and the first time I ever came across a case like this, it was mine too, was 99%. You probably, if you're smart about taking tests or like trick questions, you probably thought, well, that can't be right, or he wouldn't be making a big deal of it. If it was as easy as it looks, he wouldn't be going on about this, right? You're right, of course. So if it's not 99%, which of these is it? I'm going to guess that you're probably sitting at home listening to this. It's like, okay, he says it's not 99%. I don't know how in the world that could be. 99% accurate test. How could it? You take it. How could it not be 99% odds that you have this disease? 90%? Some of you are probably thinking that, right? Like, I don't know how it could be, but a little less likely than it seems, so 90%, I don't know how that's going to work, but whatever. If you're just wildly guessing, or you're thinking I'm really going to overstate, you're probably thinking 50-50, right? Good, safe option. Kind of in the middle, right, of my options. I'm going to guess a lot of you, or very few of you, are going to think that it's less than 1%. But it actually is. We can know what his odds are, and they are less than 1%. Now, hopefully, not just hope, this is not a statement on you if it doesn't work, but hopefully this kind of blows your mind, because one of the reasons I'm going into it is it kind of blew my mind when I heard about it. I think this is interesting, kind of mind-boggling. Hopefully you're having a similar experience. Hopefully you find this interesting. If you don't, well, maybe my idea of what's interesting is different than yours, right? Doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. It just means I've misjudged what's interesting to students, which is, well, sad as a teacher. But anyway, assuming that I got this right, how in the world can it be less than 1%? Well, think about it this way, right? It is really unlikely that the test is wrong. Only in 1 out of 100 cases would the test be wrong. But guess what? It is even more unlikely that this guy actually has the disease, right? Only, from what I've said, only 1 in 100,000 people like him have it. So we know that one of two really unlikely things has happened. Well, if one of two unlikely things has happened, which one is more likely to have happened? Right? If two things are really unlikely, but one is only kind of unlikely, 1 in 100, and one is incredibly unlikely, 1 in 100,000, odds are it's the 1 in 100 thing, right? Okay, so now you're thinking, well, I can see maybe a bit more than 50-50 then, if you put it that way, but I don't see this less than 1%. Well, think of it this way. On average, for every 100 people we test with this test, we're going to get a false positive. 1 out of 100 people, it'll come back and say they have it when they don't. If the odds are that only a 1 in 100,000 of people like this guy Pat have it, well, we're going to have to test 100,000 people. Odds don't work quite this neatly, but let's pretend they do. We're going to have to test about 100,000 people for every real positive we get back, for every person who really has the disease. Well, if we test 100,000 people, in the course of getting our one legitimate positive result, we're going to get 1,000 false positives on average, right? So, 1,000 false positives, more or less, one legitimate person who has the disease. Which group is our worried friend in? We don't know for sure, but he's probably in the group of 1,000 false positives and not in the tiny, tiny group of the one guy who legitimately has the disease. So what is my point? Besides, this is kind of mind-blowing, this is kind of cool, what is my larger point? How does it relate to Bostrom? Well, so a good general point here is that, well, probabilities are hard. And that people tend to be surprisingly dumb in reasoning about them, right? And I include myself in this, right? Before I ever started looking at this stuff, I would just predictably get questions like this horribly wrong. So it's good to know about this and I think be cautious. But I think a point more specific to Bostrom's argument is that evidence must always be evaluated relative to your base probability. Look, getting a positive test back for this disease, especially a test that's this accurate, is really strong evidence that you have it, right? It makes it way more likely that you have the disease than you was before, right? But the thing is, it was so incredibly unlikely that this guy Pat had it, that even good evidence isn't enough to make it actually likely that he does, right? Before, his odds of having it were 1 in 100,000. Now they're roughly in the neighborhood of 1 in 1,000. It's way more likely that he has it than it was before, but it's still more likely than not, by a long margin, he doesn't have it, right? This will be important when we talk about Bostrom's argument and some of the objections against it, so keep that in mind. Also, just a good general point to keep in mind, right? You need to know the basic probability before you know how good an evidence any test or any of this sort is, right? All right. So now let's move on to Bostrom's actual argument in the next lecture.